Hey everyone, thanks for being here. It's a pleasure to talk about this topic, and yeah, as mentioned, today I'll talk a bit about breaking smart contracts for fun and profit, and given some recent occurrences also about reentrancies and hard forks. Just a quick question, how many people have heard of the last not happening Ethereum hard fork? Okay, a few, cool. So yeah, that was because of us, but I'll talk about, I'll talk about that in a bit. So yeah, given that okay, yeah, I'll be old school. So, sorry. Okay, there we go. Almost. Okay, now. So yeah, I kind of assume that most of the people in the crowd are some Bitcoin people, so I just want to start off with highlighting like the main difference between Ethereum and Bitcoin. So as most of you know, Bitcoin has the UTXO model, so a transaction output can either be spent or unspent. And if we want to find out what happened to a coin, we basically start with the genesis block, then follow it all the way through until we know what happened. In Ethereum, the whole thing looks a bit different, and we have a kind of a ledger which records states, and any transaction is not an application on kind of the previous transaction in and output, but it's a modification of the state to arrive to a new state. And there are some advantages to that in the sense that we can look at blockchain data, which UTXOs are blind to, like nonces, timestamps, previous block hashes, and we can use some of that information for like source of randomness if we want to implement gambling, for example, on the blockchain. But more so if we want to have any like programmatic capabilities on the blockchain, for Bitcoin this can be done with like Bitcoin script, which has a fairly restricted set of opcodes that we can use, but they're enough to build multi-signature contracts and a lot of the very fundamental kind of programs that we want to have in such an environment. Ethereum tried to take that promise a bit further, and it has this fairly rich language which is called Solidity. And Solidity has a great promise and a lot of capabilities, but unfortunately many of the basic blocks are very broken, and which makes it even more fun to audit it and kind of look at it from a security perspective, of course. And in decentralized systems, the main questions that interest us is how do we change them? Of course, everyone knows we can't just ship an update, so really we only have two options. Either make a soft fork or a hard fork. The terms are often used like fairly interchangeably, but I found some definition by Peter Todd, who's a known Bitcoin engineer that I liked a lot. And generally we validate, or any user in the network just validates that the rules are being followed. But if in a soft fork we have new rules that are being added, then we have two groups of people. We have nodes that follow the soft fork and now adapt their new rules, and we still have the old group that does not know about this rule or decides kind of not to implement it. But given that only new rules are added, every block that is produced by the new group is still accepted by the old one, because we just further restrict. All of the old rules are still in place. And that allows for kind of a backwards compatibility. We don't have a problem that the old group doesn't accept the block of the new ones, and everyone is still kind of reconcilable in that sense. And for hard forks, there we remove some rules from the protocol, in the sense that now the group that follows the hard fork, if they create a block, the old group will not accept that block. And hence we have two histories that will be hard to reconcile at some point. Their risk of double spends attacks and ordering all of this is not trivial. And yeah, now that we know kind of so that these are the two ways forward, let's actually look a bit at how hard forks have happened in Ethereum. And we can see that totally there are like 7 hard forks that happened on Ethereum. 4 of them were actually planned. And today we'll especially have a look at those two. So the DAO fork and the fork that did not happen but was supposed to happen. Yeah, so I guess many of you have heard about the DAO, the first really big like project on Ethereum, and that's raised a lot of money, which is the reason why it gained so much publicity, of course. And just to quickly recap, so what's a DAO? It's a smart contract that holds Ether. Everyone can contribute it. For that, you get some DAO tokens, and you can use those tokens to kind of participate in a governance system or vote and things like that. So it's, on the first glance, not that complex, but of course, people can go crazy with that. You can build DAOs on top of DAOs and different decentralized autonomous organizations interacting with each other in hierarchies. There are good ideas like having self-owning cars that own themselves, know their Bitcoin worth, and then decide when to go to service or raise their fees, and other interesting things. So of course, in the DAO system, which is the concrete system that failed, they define so-called contractors, which are also just smart contracts that have certain capabilities, like they fix operational parameters, fix payment terms, and basically any participant in the DAO can have a proposal to have such a contractor work for him, meaning that to implement some additional functionality for the DAO or transfer money around or any other part. And if people agree with the proposal, they can kind of vote on it, and if not, then not. And so what we have basically is in the DAO, they had a very core functionality, which is that if I do not agree with the majority of the people, I can just kind of split off. So basically I can say, hey, you know, I don't want to participate in your DAO governance, and I want to have back the tokens that I originally participated. Or basically not even the tokens, but even the Ether that I originally contributed to get the tokens. So let's, in our example, call it the dark DAO. And let's say, hey, okay, I disagree. I will split off and I'll have my own dark DAO, so please give me my money back. I request the payout, and of course, fair enough, I get the Ethereum payout. And now the code in the DAO was structured in a way that I can first split off, then I request a certain payment, and when I receive the tokens, only then my balance is updated. So the balance update is the last operation that happens, which is fairly fine if the code kind of is not malicious, but I can request the payment again before my balance is updated and hence get the money sent again. So in code, this looks fairly easy. Like the first thing that happens is I call the dark DAO and it sends me the Ether. And the dark DAO receives the Ether and returns true. So it says, okay, thanks, everything's fine. The problem, however, is that this transfer, this sending back true, depends on how the dark DAO code is implemented. And you already can see a small star there. So the third step is, of course, in a normal case, deduct and update the balance. But if the dark DAO is evil, then in the second step, I will not send back true and said, hey, thanks, okay, I received all of the money, but I'll just call the function payout or split again and receive the money over and over and over until I drain the whole original DAO. And this is fairly much what happened. The dark DAO had a claim on almost all of the 150 million that were in the original DAO. And there were several proposals to kind of how they wanted to try and fix it. One of them was a soft fork. So like this. And the soft fork unfortunately did not go through because in the soft fork itself they introduced another vulnerability. Basically the soft fork had the idea that just every transaction that tries to send money or retrieve money from this dark DAO, they would just block it and filter it out. And every transaction has some incentive for miners to be picked up, basically by paying money or paying the fee. However, this transaction was supposed to be a special class, kind of to get everyone up to speed and helping with the hack. But the problem is there was a way to abuse it, to send out empty transactions such that no one could basically use the blocks anymore, and you could denial of service the whole Ethereum network. So yeah, unfortunately that one got called off, or luckily. And the next only way to go about this was a hard fork where you really kind of force everyone to accept the new chain history, not be compatible with any priors, and yeah, completely restructure all of the history that we had before. The backup idea that they had was a counter hack where a group of good hackers kind of wanted to drain the money to not the dark DAO, but like to a white hat DAO, basically faster than the attacker, do the same attack and then redistribute the money. Of course, there's a trust issue there because how do you know that the goodly drained money ever reaches you? And the answer is you don't. there are also a lot of really interesting conspiracy theories about that. If someone Googles the Robin Hood group white hack. Yep. So that was a summary of the first DAO hack that I really just wanted to briefly touch upon, because I think the more interesting one and the more recent one is about the hard fork that did not happen, which is the Constantinople hard fork. So this is the Ethereum roadmap. So they have regular they call them software upgrades now, not hard forks anymore, how they wanted to go through. And so far, all of them went through successfully, except the Constantinople upgrade. And how such a hard fork basically looks, it's the same as in Bitcoin. In Bitcoin, you have the BIPs, the Bitcoin Improvement Proposals. In Ethereum, they are called EIPs, so just like the Ethereum Improvement Proposals. And they consist, we can see that here, of different substandards. And concretely, for this hard fork, there are 5 standards planned, but especially one was interesting, that was the 1283. And the 1283 has some long name, but basically there was one core point, and that is that it was wanted to reduce excessive gas costs. And what that meant is that previously, any S-store, that means any contract that wanted to say something to its blockchain, would have to pay 5,000 gas to do so. And any transfer or send, that is any kind of call to another contract, like the split we had previously, only gives you 2,300 gas. That means that if my contract calls someone else's contract, it only gives them 2,300 gas, and it's not enough to save anything to the blockchain or write some data, so it's basically safe because no one can touch data with that gas dependent. However, of course, if we have the reduced gas storage, that allows us to, not allows us, but first it defines that there are dirty S stores. That means that if there's a storage location on the blockchain, which I originally already wrote to in the very same transaction, then writing to it again will only cost me 200 gas. And the idea of this was, of course, very noble, to make it cheaper and accessible for everyone. But now this transfer and send gas dependent of 2,300 will allow me to actually write to storage locations in different contracts and do things I should not do. And there's a pattern to this that we can kind of abstract to identify which contracts are vulnerable to such a hack. And it is surprisingly simple. So if we have kind of 2 contracts with the function f and g, then in the first contract, it does a call, which is like a transfer or a send, gives 2,300 gas. Then here, I can write to the storage location of a location that was already modified because it's cheaper now. And if I then load that value and do something based on the value that I modified, I have a successful attack of writing to storage where I should not be able to have done this. And it just so happened that we found this attack roughly 3 days before the announcement and before the announced hard fork date was happened. And we scanned a lot of the contracts, and we found that some of them tend to be vulnerable. And that was the reason why the hard fork had to be called off, because there was really no guarantee that there are no critical other contracts that we just missed. So there's a really detailed walkthrough, like on Codebase, with all of these examples that I kind of skipped. There are references in the slides if someone's really interested on the code level of it. Also, please interrupt if there are questions. So yeah, the aftermath was the blog post that the Ethereum hard fork was called off. People tried to accuse us a lot of like shorting ETH before making the announcement, which we did not do. And there was an incident report that we published together with Trail of Bits, another security company in the space, where we summarize kind of best practices or what should be or shouldn't be done to avoid these things. Mostly, of course, the EIP process itself, kind of proposing how such critical systems change over time, should be revisited from the ground up. Because currently there's no flag for kind of when you say, okay, this proposal can be really security critical, that someone goes and actually like has a look at it. It's just posted just like everyone else. And kind of really sensitive topics, of course, are gas costs, upgradability, a new instruction set or new opcodes that we can have around there, or changes how value transactions work. And of course, it's important to know what parts of the blockchain will ever be changed or not changed. I mean, there's a fairly strong consensus in the Bitcoin community that the 21 million limit will hold, and there are several incentive assumptions based around that, and that's important. But for Ethereum, really, as of now, you have no guarantee whether instruction semantics will change or not. whether the gas limit will change or not. And you can't even be sure that this store, which is an instruction that was already there before, will not change its behavior in a future hard fork, which basically makes it impossible to write future-proof contracts because you never know what will happen. And of course, those are not the only vulnerabilities. Solidity is a fairly young language with only, I think, a few years in development, and the dev team is, as of now, like 6 people. 2 years ago, there were 2 guys writing this, all of it. So unexpected ether flow is one of those. There's no way to block ether coming into a contract, so you can never do the exact balance check, because I can always send ether to your contract, no matter if you want it or not. Especially a neat trick is doing this through self-destruct. So Ethereum has a kind of a code that allows one to kill a contract, and then I can have all funds that are still in my contract that I killed, I can send to someone. And even if it looks like my contract does not have that functionality, I could call a contract that would then self-destruct myself and then send the funds. So yeah, you can't really rely on that. Insecure coding are kind of generic security principles, like having a function that has no modifier. If, for example, if I have a wallet that I want to initialize, then I want to make sure that only the owner can do so, of course, because if I don't have the private keys, I shouldn't have access to the wallet. But most often people just forget to add that check, and this is, for example, how the Parity Bug happened, where roughly, I think, another 50 million were frozen in one of the most popular Ethereum wallets just because of that. Other examples is the use of unsafe inputs. So for example, if I submit a hash to prove that I know something, all data, this is not unique to Ethereum, but of course all data on the blockchain is public, and if someone submits a hash, I can just replay it to prove that I also have it. Then I can also manipulate the order of transactions, which is very important. Miners have different incentives to create certain orders in blocks and publish those block templates around, and I can never or rarely rely on a certain ordering within a block. And yeah, there's a possible front-running attack where I can overrun a transaction by paying, for example, a higher gas fee and incentivizing the miner to pick my transaction up higher up in the block. And this is a very valid attack in any ERC20 token. Like, this standard itself is vulnerable to this, but it's just not very publicized. And of course, in any smart contract, you should never use block information, because all of this can be manipulated by miners if they really want to. That's like difficulty, gas limit, the block number, and the block timestamps. There are great articles out there on breaking smart contracts for gambling, which is especially interesting because they try to use randomness, and you can predict a lot of the things that are happening on the blockchain. Yeah. So of course, manual review of all of this is really hard, because you have things like concurrency, and thinking about that is super unintuitive. The complexity is very high. And also, as I said, everything on the blockchain is public, at least on public blockchains. And hence, keeping that in mind is also not trivial. And most of all, as an auditor, I have limited time to look over the code and try to understand how it works and what attacks are possible. But once it's out on the blockchain, an attacker has infinite time to have a look at it and can hack it for as long as it's there. And of course, all of these are just attacks on the code itself, but once it's on the chain, I still depend on the security of the underlying network. Examples of this are, as I mentioned, malicious miner. They can manipulate the block information. They can also censor certain transactions or just delay them by milliseconds, which is often enough for high-frequency trading bots. Transaction reordering, I mentioned, front-running. All of these are major issues for decentralized exchanges. And yeah, there's a very interesting talk on that by Phil Diane that I recommend to everyone who kind of does high-frequency in the blockchain space. And he highlights a lot of those issues in detail. So basically, if you look at to sum some of these things up, we have a lifetime of a contract, which is we develop it, then we deploy it, and then it's post-deployment. So during development, I can add bugs. When I do the audits, I can still miss things if I do them manually. And post-deployment, as I mentioned, once it's out on the network, there's still plenty of attacks to go. And so kind of the solutions to these are, okay, during development, we should definitely use tools to prove certain properties about contracts. during the code audits, we should also rely on automation and being able to define clear specifications of how a contract is supposed to behave. And once it's on the chain, we can still monitor any activity that is going on there. So what I want to go through now is the tools that we use at Chain Security, and we developed them in collaboration with the university in Zurich, that's ETH. And the first one is a static analyzer. It's called Securify, securify.ch. It's open source and anyone can try it out. And the idea is fairly simple, that we take the binary of a contract, so the compiled Solidity language. We then have an intermediate representation of it, which captures the main behavior. Where do I write to storage? Where do I read from storage? Where do I do calls? And from that, I go a bit further and kind of try to interpret what does this really mean on a semantic level. And at the end, I can then generate a small report that says, okay, you should look at line 15, line 27, and line 30 because certain patterns are broken and do not hold up. The good thing about this is as we learn about new and insecure patterns, for example, like with the hack that led to the hard fork not happening, we can encode these patterns and then rescan contracts that are already out there. So this is modular and extensible and allows us to go kind of with as much patterns as we come up with. There's also a symbolic execution engine that we call Glyph. And there we use not just a smart contract, but we also need a functional specification. A functional specification should just very exactly define what a contract does, because arguably any behavior of the contract that is not what I expect to be is also a vulnerability. And this functional specification is ideally provided by the teams actually developing and writing the code, or it can be done by us as the auditors. And yeah, so as an input, it gets a configuration file and those formally expressed properties, and then it allows me to prove that certain statements always hold. However, this is not very easy because if I have a contract, then I have it's called a state explosion. So from the initial state, I can go to and call, for example, if it's an ICO contract, I can invest or I can claim refund. And then the question is, okay, then I have the second order of transactions, and then I can, again, use different values and so on and so on. So really, the width is just too big, and more so, the depth is potentially unbounded because I have transaction over transaction. However, there's a neat trick that one can use, and that is called this symbolic verification, and we use symbolic and not concrete values, meaning that we don't care if in the first state we invest like 1,000 or 900. We just care that there is an integer that represents the amount that we invest. And that already gives us feasible width. And if we go a step further, then we can kind of formulate for each of the final blocks, we can in logic express what happens in that state really, and that allows us to use so-called fixed points, and by that we can also bound the depth. So in the end, it kind of manages to compress the state explosion that we have to a bunch of logical expressions that we can then kind of really mathematically analyze and prove. So we built on a lot of the research that was already done in terms of proving statements. So as a small example of this would be, we have two contracts. We have the crowd sale and the escrow, something that is fairly common in most ICOs. And we can think about what properties really interest us here. And let's say, okay, we want that the sum of all deposits equals all the ether in the escrow. So we want to make sure there's no like money pre-allocated or something like that. Then it would be nice to know that the investor actually cannot claim refunds after the goal is reached. So to be sure that everyone has the same conditions, and once the goal is reached, no one can retract their offering. And something that, for example, we would not like to hold is that the escrow never allows the beneficiary to withdraw all of the deposits and the investors to claim refunds, because investors should be able to claim refunds. And yeah, and how this looks like, we formally kind of encode this. It looks a bit like Haskell for the programmers, or like it has a functional style to it. And then we just need to encode all of this by ourselves, or ideally at one point this will be done by the team of devs that actually do the project. And then we get a very nice like property verified, or property does not hold, when there is a trace that can show us that, okay, this is the kind of chain of transaction that needs to be done to get to that state. And the third part is the security monitoring. So we have the demo that we made is for Beauty Coin, which is a coin that suffered a integer overflow bug. basically by adding two very big numbers, it got back to 0 again. And it was exploited as well. And the beauty of monitoring or kind of visualizing these things is that you can react faster than ideally an attacker who wants to do so. So we have here, we monitor overflows. Each of these green bars represents like 5 blocks summarized. You can click on each one of them and then you see kind of the next zoom in. And then we know, okay, so we have an overflow that happened somewhere within our blocks. Then we know, oh wow, there happened like a high value transfer. So someone tried to pull out a lot of money after we detected an anomaly. And then of course, ideally, and the last bar that is added by us, that's not the reality, but ideally you could be as fast as the next block to already pause the contract to kind of withhold the attacker from pulling the money back out. We demoed this with Kyber network, and they use it for their decentralized exchange as well. So to sum it up, the platform is fairly simple. You have the contract and the functional specification, and then you just add the 3 things I talked about: the static analyzer, the symbolic verification, and we also currently are working on AI-based fuzzing, where we want to learn what transactions maximize the code coverage to find the really hard corner cases in those contracts. And the output of that is a report that we sent to our clients. And we worked with a lot of people in the space, so Kyber Network, Proof of Authority, Augur, Paxos, IXEC, and so on. Those are really interesting projects with serious teams who are very worried about their security. And I want to round it all up with a small outlook, and that would be, so the complexity clearly increases. I mean, maybe not in Bitcoin, but in other blockchains, we see that smart contracts or second layer solutions that allow smart contracts gain traction. The languages become richer. Of course, we have more and more cross-chain interactions. So some speakers before me mentioned atomic swaps and things like that. Second layer networks. And of course, manual review gets increasingly harder and almost impossible at some point, depending on the system. And so the tooling really becomes essential. And of course, we have currently not the case, but overall, in comparison to where we started off, higher valuation, which means there's more risk to all of this, more attacks, and luckily also more research funding to prevent those things from happening. That would be it from my side. Thank you.
Do you do this research voluntarily, or are you paid, like with Ethereum?
No.
How did you find out? Because it was so last minute.
Yeah. So the story of finding the bug was fairly trivial. It was internally we have kind of lunch and learns and reviews of new iterations of what's going on in the Ethereum ecosystem. And when we're reviewing the upcoming EIPs for the hard fork, which we did like Friday the week before it was supposed to happen, we usually do those things there. And someone just had the idea of looking that something looks fishy if you reduce the gas costs in such critical positions. And then over the weekend, our CTO and some other guys from Trail of Bits, the other company I mentioned, spend their weekends actually testing out, writing proof of concept, scanning for contracts, seeing if there's anything there. And then we realized that it is. And that's the moment we notified. There's a kind of to do those things responsibly. There's a vulnerability disclosure page by the Ethereum Foundation where we submitted our findings and were then contacted briefly after by the Ethereum Foundation security team.
So it was accidentally that you found out?
Yeah, I mean, just by review. It was not that we were specifically looking for holes in the upcoming hard fork, yeah.
But there's so many vulnerabilities, it's amazing actually.
I mean, it's a great space to work in as a security researcher.
Quite risky as an investor.
I mean, I don't give investment advice.
So next question.
I was kind of surprised that you put lots of solidity, because as far as I know, most of the tools actually analyze the bytecodes, and so you can use several languages to compile the bytecodes, so solidity is not the only language. It is the most popular so far, but people are switching to bytecode. So isn't the issue solidity disappearing in this space? And also solidity in itself is becoming more strict.
Yeah, so I'd quickly kind of doubt a bit the fact that the community is switching to Viper, because so far we've seen really few projects with traction behind it. And while we're excited about the research that is going on there, personally, I don't see that many projects going in that direction. But some of our tools work on the EVM bytecode level. So Solidity actually works on, Securify works on the compiled Solidity code. The symbolic execution engine works a bit differently. But yeah, we look at different levels in the hierarchy. And we also have a look at kind of upcoming languages. Yule is another one that seems promising at the moment. So yeah, we try to diversify, of course. For Solidity becoming stricter, yeah, that's definitely true. We see a lot of kind of more funds from the Ethereum Foundation going there. The team gets bigger, and they have some experienced guys now, so things are improving, definitely.
And I'm sorry, I'm going to throw in another question, rather remark. The vulnerability you discovered, we're not certain that actual smart contracts are vulnerable. So it's possible that the vulnerabilities you discovered are actually test deployments, things that actually don't matter anymore. And developers shouldn't have relied on the reentrancy bug being impossible because of the gas cost, of the limit of gas cost. So I mean, my own opinion would be just go on with it, because developers shouldn't have relied on it. And this is a vulnerability that arises afterwards, but developers shouldn't have put it in in the first place.
Yeah, so maybe quickly to counter that, there's a very effective software design pattern, which is checks, effects, interactions. So you first check how the conditions are, then you do kind of the interactions, and then only lastly you do the effect. So if you really strictly follow that pattern, it is indeed true that those vulnerabilities would not have occurred. But there were vulnerable contracts to the particular reentrancy there. I think this boils down to the discussion of whether one can rely on instruction semantics to be immutable or not. Yeah, I mean, I agree, it's a debatable point.
Another question?
Thank you. From the security point of view, do you think that spending time writing Solidity or other platforms, it might be a good idea or a bad idea instead of, for example, creating a library on Haskell and doing this kind of stuff in a proof language, functional language with all these mathematical requirements that you can actually scope your security risks? Or do you think it's a good idea to just continue with Solidity?
Yeah, so I mean, I would not deem myself qualified to tell the Ethereum Foundation whether you should scrap Solidity and start over or not. But I think if you really want to build things now and you're interested in the space, then Solidity is the only way to go if you really want to deploy and build systems that go to production. If you're more interested kind of on the research side of things, then yeah, I think there's a lot to contribute by looking at different ways of designing languages to be used in smart contracts.
One more question? One more.
My understanding of all this kind of really basic, from trading perspective, just as a user. The transactions, Ethereum transactions are states, right? And they are
state changes.
State changes.
Yeah, so I have a state, and then I apply a transaction. You get,
So this can be represented as a kind of limited set of states and changes as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you can test it like how strong it is by randomizing these things, right?
Exactly. So what the symbolic execution engine does, it expresses those kind of state transitions really as changes in logical expressions, like on concrete inputs. So yeah, that's very much what we do.
Like Markov chain or just...
Yeah.
Okay.
Comparably.
Okay, Daniel, thank you very much.
Thanks.